Welcome to another episode of Just One More Fix. This is James. With me in this episode is Kurt and Lacey.
Hey.
You can find us online at justonemorefix.com or on Twitter at justonemorefix. If you like us, head over to iTunes or to Google Play and give us a rating and a comment. This is episode number 8, and we are going to talk about the trinity of plot, setting, and scope. And now, it's time to get our gaming fix. Welcome to Just One More Fix.
Hey.
Couple announcements.
Aww.
Actually, just one. We're gonna kind of give you guys a
Long pause.
give you guys a kind of a
Suspenseful.
Didn't see that coming.
just to update you guys on our release schedule. Our plan right now is to release our podcasts on Wednesday, and we're gonna do one review a week of most likely indie and small press games and some mid-level press games. That'll drop on Fridays. Probably either this week or next week, there ought to be a blog post, gaming-related blog post on Mondays. So look for those. They'll be linked on justonemorefix.com or on your podcast aggregator. So the blogs won't update on the podcast aggregator like iTunes or whatever, so you have to come to the website for that. So just look for those. Hopefully you enjoy it, and we'll keep making some awesome content for you guys.
On a side note, I'm currently looking for a blog writer to write my blog post.
Ghostwriter.
250
It's
words.
only if you want
I
to.
pay you in high fives.
And
You have to drive here to get
winning
them.
smiles.
Right. All right, so today we're going to talk about the Venn diagram and the trinity of plot, setting, and scope. We try to figure out how it was that normal progression of our zero to play thing, that what would become next, whether it was plot, scope, or setting, and they're all kind of married together.
But first, some definitions.
I guess, yeah, definitions, I guess. So plot is what you're doing in the game, like what the game is about.
The narrative structure of the story, I
Right.
would say.
Plot is what happens,
Right. Setting is where.
where it happens.
And scope is
How
the
big it
size
is.
or how big or how important it is.
Size is important when it comes to scope.
It matters.
It does.
Say
So what would you say came first?
the chicken. Sorry.
Sorry, I couldn't keep it together there.
It's all good.
It just flows so naturally. Oh, yeah. Like that. Okay. All right.
Good. So
Something
what would you
very
say
warm.
came first? Plot, setting, or scope? Like when you plan out your games, what comes to mind for you first?
Setting.
Well,
Setting.
actually, you know what? I'm going to let me back this up.
Too late. Okay, I'm going to say
on.
setting. I decide what sort of universe we're going to be looking at. Where are we going to be playing in the sense of, sci-fi obviously writes, well, it doesn't always have to, but sci-fi writes for me differently than fantasy. So I've got to decide what kind of story we're going to do.
Lacey?
I would say I'm actually probably a mix of both setting and scope, because, for example, for the game that I'm going to be running on Monday, I didn't
Halloween.
have a lot of time, and I was planning on it being a one-shot horror game, so that sort of defines the scope in and of itself. The fact that it's a one-shot game.
You might say that's a theme first.
Well, no, because the scope...
Well,
I'm just
we
good.
already
I'm good
established
for-
we
I'm good
have
for
a
everything.
broad theme when we start, like
Right,
sci-fi
right.
or horror or
I'm
whatever.
just
So I
poking.
knew I was running a one-shot horror game, so the scope is small, and then the next thing I figured out was setting.
I'm just poking Kurt is all it really is.
Okay, so, but see, I have to wonder, because scope, when I think of scope, I think of personal, local, regional, intergalactic, universal. I mean, you could have a scope that covers a save the world in one night.
I think we'll dig into that, into the fine points
You
of that here in a little
could,
bit.
but if you're having a game where you're saving the world in one night, your scope is probably still going to be kind of limited.
Mm-hmm.
See, I'm thinking
Unless you're like a teleporter where you could be all over the world in one single night. Unless you're if you're playing Santa
So I
Claus
think-
game
I think
when
a-
you're saving
Think
the
a definition
world.
of scope, then, because I'm thinking of scope differently, obviously.
Okay.
Because you could have what's the movie? So Evolution is an example. The movie Evolution.
Okay, yeah, with Duchovny, right? Back
Yes.
in the 90s.
So they're saving the world, but that is all taking place within a singular town.
Mm-hmm.
So the scope is
This
still
is something.
small.
So you sent me some stuff.
The theme
we-
is epic.
Yeah, we talked
but
about
the
some
scope
things.
is small.
I guess you sent me some information and stuff, and I read it, and this is a few things that I thought of precisely where they kind of are married together in some way, and we'll kind of dig into that here in a minute. For me, I start with generally scope first, because I think about whether I want to run a big game or a small game. And that kind of comes with the theme, whether I want it to be, a personal story game or I want it to be a big, galaxy trotting sci-fi style game. So I think and how I put those together, it kind of is different. It's just sort of like my mood, Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think of scope in terms of like a lot of horror stuff is going to be very personal. Mm-hmm. Versus anything that involves the Doctor could be a universe-saving experience.
Right.
Star Trek is big for big scope. I mean, they're always saving the world. I mean, there's nothing small that seems to happen in old Star Trek movies.
Well, see, in what you sent me, you talked about, you had it broken down into several categories, or personal, local, regional,
like national I guess
and worldwide or whatever.
And then 6 would be like the universe.
Okay, so here's what I actually kind of funny that you said that, because I actually. That's exactly where I came at it from, was what you said, Lacey, is that when I think of Lord of the Rings, right? Lord of the Rings is an epic story about the entirety of Middle-earth. But really, it's a personal story about the relationship between Sam and Frodo.
Yeah, I would say that's the core of the story, but the scope of the story is world-saving.
Right, but it's personal about Frodo. If you were to play that game...
it was a story about how Gollum got screwed over.
Depends on which character you're playing, I suppose.
Then you're looking at when you're looking at the setting, your setting, let's say in Lord of the Rings, is a fantasy setting, okay?
Right.
But then all scope, then there's no such thing as a big story, because if all stories are personal,
I disagree.
That is a large scope.
I disagree. But see... It focuses very closely on the personal relationship between Frodo and Sam. Whereas if you look at a lot of other stories, it's not such a personal story.
Such as? I'm not trying to be snarky either.
No.
I legitimately don't know.
I had thought of a few, actually. All right, so I can't offhand think of any specific examples, but what I'm trying to get to is in Lord of the Rings, they very closely focus on the relationship between those two characters.
Agreed.
It's a very central premise of friendship and loyalty and not letting each other down. And there are a lot of stories that, while they focus on the relationship between two people, but not quite as directly.
I think my argument, though, is less philosophical and more of I've got to plot out a story, nuts and bolts.
Okay.
I mean, I don't disagree with you. You're all right. But when I sit down and I go, okay, I'm going to start this story at a personal level. And then if they level up, if they don't all die, if there's no TPK, they're going to end at this level, probably.
Let me ask you this. You had all these categories broken down. And something that I thought of Matt immediately was personal makes sense. That's very clear. A little bit larger than that, makes sense. But once you get outside of a certain range of like city, I'm not sure that it really makes a difference, because the difference, if it's not in one place,
okay,
then it may as well be in 1,000.
Well, see, I think some of it has to do with
it's like a degree of difference thing.
Yeah, but I think for me it's important when I'm writing, because if you're familiar with Delta Green, which is a conspiracy horror type thing, or Conspiracy X, which you've run, you can be very worldwide, but you've got to be very below board. Mm-hmm. Okay. Once you get up to, now I gave it a 1 through 6 number just because it's the number of sides on a cube dice, and it made it nice and easy for me. That once you get up to a level 5, let's say you're going to a national, international, world-spanning thing, you're no longer underground. You are worldwide. You are the International Monster Hunters Corporation, and everyone now sees you.
No, but then it's nationwide.
Well, I know, but you're not seen. So you have to avoid. For me, that's an indication of going. Like, you always have to be doing things. You've always got to be saving the world, but you can't be seen to be saving the world.
But I don't think that changes scope, though, because your scope is still just as big. It's just an element of what you can and can't be caught doing.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of argument on the edges. I mean, I'll concede that. But let's say, I'll take, for example, I've just started watching it, the first couple episodes of Luke Cage. Okay? You want a local scope? It basically seems to take place in a neighborhood in New York right now. And so right now, it's a very local scope. My guess is it's going to ramp up. But it might not. I don't know. I am not familiar with Luke Cage at all.
Right.
So his scope is very narrow versus Superman or versus Iron Man.
Well, really, Iron Man's a little bit different, but most of the DC heroes, Batman, Superman, most of those guys, they're all one city, and that's really all they do.
So their scope, except for Superman, doesn't he save the world occasionally?
But it's all because when he's fighting Lex Luthor in his town.
Yeah, but at the same time, he saves the world. I would call that an epic worldwide scope if it's a thing.
But if you're not traveling worldwide, does that make it worldwide?
I think it still does.
It only affects the scope if you're seeing things outside of that and making relationships outside of that. So, for example, I could play whatever, NATO, the RPG, and as
Wow,
long as
God.
it's still just all of us politicians talking about our countries, and we're not actually viewing any of the smaller people, if you will, and making connections with them, then it's still a small scope game.
Yeah,
so the
'cause it's
decisions we're
off-screen.
making is affecting the entire world, but all we care about is the relationships that are existing in this room.
If it's off screen, it doesn't matter.
But then for me, that definition becomes meaningless then, because it's like a power level sort of thing.
Mhm.
If you're playing NATO, the game, then that single guerrilla cell in wherever is irrelevant to you, because you could drop some
Exactly.
missiles on that and make that problem go away. But if your scope is small, if you're a resistance fighter cell in that country, that 30-person guerrilla group, there's significant problems.
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
But your scope is still small. So
So there is no such thing.
Does the group of people in the NATO conference room make any more difference to the guerrilla fighting group in the mountains than the guerrilla fighting
Because
group in the mountains
here's what
makes to the
okay.
NATO group?
Let me frame
I
this.
would argue that it doesn't.
Let me frame this
All
a little
right, I
differently.
will-
Let me frame this a little differently. If you're playing, for your example, NATO the RPG,
We just invented a game.
right?
Wow.
You're welcome.
Yeah, hooray! But fundamentally, that is a political RPG that involves 30 to 60 characters. That is a small game. Because you're never going to go to the guerrilla place and do anything.
Then there's no such thing as a big game.
There is.
If
Then
you
tell me.
You have to go there. If it's things
As
that
characters.
Yes, if it happens. Okay, so your previous example with Delta Green or Conspiracy X, right? So when things happen, something happens we're in Los Angeles. Something happens off camera in New York. We travel there and go do something. That's on camera action. Something happens in Moscow. We travel there and we go do it.
Which is why I would argue that Lord of the Rings is one of the largest scope
Yes,
games.
because it's all on-screen action.
But it's not just setting, because they go to each of these places. It's not just them walking through, passing by. They stop in those places. They make new connections. You meet new NPCs. And
no doubt.
each city has a relevance
Mhm.
to the overall story arc.
But more important, where I think what the key thing for it is it's all on-screen action.
Okay.
Because it's things you see and do.
See, I'm going to stick by my its character power and their relation to the universe. You've got a very geographically tied definition. That's fine.
It's not. No, it has nothing to do with geography.
It doesn't.
It has to do
It
with
has a
what's.
lot to do with
I'm
Well,
just going to say you just
but
made the
no.
you went there geographic
but see,
argument.
But I
my-
think power and influence matters too. All I'm saying
Ah!
is it's not the only thing that matters.
I think the only thing that I think matters is on-camera action.
Because what I'm
what you're-
saying is
what
like your
you're
NATO
doing-
group has all the power and influence in the world, but if they're only inside this little room, your scope is still small.
Because it's about personal relationships at that point.
Okay.
I think it's.
I don't agree, but I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think it's like for me, it's what happens on camera.
Okay.
That's or what the game, like what you physically do in the game or whatever. Where do we go from here? I guess so that pretty much ties up scope. I guess.
And we're done.
We're done. Yeah.
So we'll see you next week, guys.
Yeah. No,
So,
that's just.
so I guess scope. As far as let's kind of lead that into setting. I guess it's kind of because plot. I think is where this is all really fundamentally pushing towards.
Well, that's where the rubber meets the.
It's what we're doing.
Do you?
It's
Let
what's for dinner.
Let me pose this question to you. First off, we kind of like a little bit of a pop topic, I guess you might say, but a quick question. What do you prefer? I'm going to start with Lacey. What do you prefer to play and run? Do you prefer to run or play personal games or epic games?
I kind of prefer to run epic games, but the reason is because I'm lazy and it's easier.
How is Epic easier? There's more to keep
Because-
track of.
No. it's not.
No, there's all these little adventures
Okay,
and you can go
yes.
anywhere. Personal games, you're still limited in what else is going on, that you really have to focus on player
Mhm.
relationships, and you have to kind of build social tension
Oh, I'm
and things.
gonna
And
have to
I
disagree
find
with
that to be
Sicker.
difficult.
Yeah, it's much more involved because it's much more intimate. When I say the world is going to end, get the atomic football,
The Q bomb.
yeah, and turn it off. That's not a personal story. It's not detail or like there might be details in it. Do A, B, C, and D,
Yeah.
but it's a lot different than saying you've had this huge tumultuous relationship with a person who was your ally becomes your enemy. Now maybe they're the enemy of my enemy is now my friend. Like there's a lot of detail that goes into that and tension and that kind of stuff.
Like we'll have to play Juggernaut, which is the computer that sees the future LARP, because that is I think one of the most ultimate person. It's 6 people in a room.
Oh, right.
And that's actually what it is. 6 people in a room. You know, that kind of thing. But yeah, no, I get where you're coming from, but I see them both as being a challenge because of my heretical definition of scope, that the bigger the scope of the game gets, the more NPCs I'm keeping track of until I basically have binders and databases full of
But the difference is, though, is you have a blurb about them, but it's not necessarily personal. You're not tracking necessarily like you got swindled out of $20 at a bet, and now I hit you.
Yes, but I am keeping track of how bad they feel about you. I have hash marks, positive.
But that's hash marks, not specific scenes of things that the players did.
No, but that's cues that let me know how much they hate you, and so that when when you come back to them and need them. So I'm sorry, I'm stealing your thunder here, but go ahead. You need to finish.
So you said that's what you like to run. How about what do you like to play?
I like to play both.
Okay. Is there one you like more than the other?
It really depends on my mood, and it's really the same thing. It's just the political, social small scope games are more intense and involve more thought.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have the energy at the end of the day to dedicate to that, then I'm fine with those games. If I'm more in a mood like, let's just sit down and turn off my brain and RPG and relax for a few,
right?
Then I
stab bags of experience and take their treasure.
If I'm dungeon crawling, then that's cool. But
you got that wrong. It's beat the experience out of the bags of treasure.
My bad. I'm sorry. I stand corrected.
So it's, am I turning on my quiet ear brain or am I turning on my munchkin brain?
Okay. What about you, Kurt?
I'll tell you what, maybe I'm a heretic, but I will tell you what, I love to combine them as much as possible. I obsess, if I do a long-term game, I like to start it off personal. If I can, because I think a lot of those stories, like the Luke Skywalker story, starts with a kid on a farm.
Grows, right.
Yeah, it gives you the opportunity. Now, how big it gets all very much depends on what you're doing. But I'm very much a fan of because of my definition of scope, to start off small and give it the opportunity to get as big as possible. I've got no endpoint in mind for you. If you do manage to find the ultimate evil and save the world, fantastic. If you only ever focus on the barony you're in, taking it over and doing whatever, that's fine for me too. Again, I don't like to necessarily predefine where these games are going to go, but I want to give it the opportunity and give you enough rope to hang yourself.
Right.
Yeah.
So for me, I like to run horror games, which in my opinion, most horror games are personal stories.
We can actually agree on that, I
think. And right on. I will say I'm a contrarian, so sometimes I just argue the opposite just to make things interesting and push on people. Yeah, surprise, surprise. But I do like horror games the most. So I like personal horror. I think is just better in general. Mm-hmm. So I like to run both personal games and play in personal games is my actual preference. I just think it makes it more interesting. It makes things deeper. You get more emotionally invested when you want to kill the guy that's beaten you 4 times as opposed to tackling the guy with the nuclear football.
Let me ask you though, if horror scales up, does that suddenly become an adventure instead?
I feel like once it gets so big, you lose the aspect of horror and it becomes adventure.
Or right now,
if it is an adventure, maybe it's suspense thriller. Because suspense thriller and horror are very close together in a lot of ways. But once something gets so big that it's not about...
I think we kind of touched on it in the horror podcast too, where your larger scope horror games have to involve more of a, like you said, suspense thriller or a mystery element. Mm-hmm. So you're trying to kind of solve the mystery surrounding the larger bad guy, and you can kind of work in smaller horror aspects along the way too.
Right.
But
and the Lovecraft thing is kind of a good example of that, where it's usually you're stopping some kind of world-ending event, but it's about personal horror for that individual and the things that they encounter. But you're trying to stop something that's much bigger than them from happening. So I guess it's kind of a combination of both.
Which is why everyone should go out and read the Delta Green novels.
Anyway. And those are basically all mystery.
Yeah, I was getting mystery investigation.
You're solving a mystery.
Yeah, so just to wrap that,
I
like it all.
So I don't disagree. I just was curious if anybody had any preference on what they ran versus what they played. I always think it's kind of interesting to find out. So, because I gotta say, doing this has made me kind of be introspective on some of my gaming and my habits, and I think it's been a cool experience.
Well, yeah, because all those things I've always ever wanted to know about you guys and what you like and what you prefer sitting around the table and what you think I do best, which you never told me when I asked you. Finally, we found out after. It's like,
It's just introspective. It makes you think about things in a different way. Why do I do things a certain way? It's just,
Well, and how can I improve my storytelling, which is really what all this is about. At least
I agree. When we talk about settings. So, what do you choose certain settings because of the scope? Like, as an example, when you say I'm going to run a sci-fi game, would you choose the Star Wars universe over the Star Trek universe over the Firefly universe because of the scope of game you want to run?
That's like asking me to choose between children. I mean, that's
no, it's not. Some kids are just stepping. No, I'm just kidding. That's total garbage.
Oh, evil.
I'm just not a fan of Star Trek. I'm sorry.
I don't know. It all depends. And again, I'll choose the setting depending on the kinds of plots I want to run. I mean, obviously, the kind of plot you're going to run in a Star Trek universe, those are vastly different, especially if you're talking about classic Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually always had trouble writing in those because it's a ship full of paladins flying around the universe solving everyone's problems.
That's what's interesting.
It's designed to be episodic.
Yeah.
Just like a Firefly game is designed to be episodic.
And I would say that Star Wars is not necessarily
episodic
in a bigger way.
Star Wars is an epic game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it takes place in that larger meta structure that's going on. But but if I choose the system that one of the systems and settings that I know best is Traveler.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a Far Future Enterprises thing. Used to be Game Designers Workshop. It's very old school space opera, and I know that the scope and the setting for that is normally enormous. Okay, it takes place over this huge galactic empire that it takes the better part of a year to get across. Okay, and I know that the scope of that and the feel of it is very, very big. If I wanted to do a more personal sci-fi, I would certainly do a harder sci-fi universe, because it is so much more difficult to get out of. If you have a aliens type world where, you can't just press a button, bloop, and the rest of the fleet shows up. If you have a Delta V budget, and you can't
But what about Star Wars in that sense? That's a very personal story.
Yeah, but the scope is enormous. In its normal sort of setting, I've not played in a lot of personal games, and maybe this might have been the Game Masters I had, but I've never played in a personal, intimate sort of. It's always rebels against the Empire, and blasters going off, and stuff blowing up.
It's part of the reason why I don't necessarily like to play Star Wars now, because we played a lot of Star Wars quite a ways ago. And we had both. We had both where it was, the Yuzong Vong Wars and then the Rebels versus the Empire. And then also personal games where we were just smugglers, wacky smugglers on a ship trying to make a buck. Almost a Firefly story game before Firefly.
Setting and scope, like I said, could be tied together. So Dark Heresy would be a great example. So you have a huge sci-fi world there, and you can go anywhere, and then there's this massive, empire that, just spans galaxies. But you could just as easily tell a story about your small cluster of guys that are within a single planet system that are, combating this problem.
Well, that's a really good example, because Dark Heresy fundamentally is about playing a cell of acolytes that go to investigate some kind of heresy. And that heresy is, on a space station or on a planet.
And just to clarify for folks who don't know, this is the Warhammer 40K universe. Correct?
Yeah, produced by Fantasy Flight Games, Dark Heresy. So you go and investigate some kind of heresy that people are involved in because they're against the Emperor or whatever. And that, while the game is very big and you can go anywhere, each individual story or episode that you go do is relatively small because you're hunting down a cult or whatever it is.
Now, see, on the other hand, I think that games like the various Firefly properties, virtually demand a small scope. If they scale up, it's done. You've got, because our game, the moment that it looked like it was, we have now officially scaled up, we need to, we put a cap on it and called it a day.
Well, I think that's because when you tell me Firefly, as that's what we're going to play in a Firefly world, there was nothing in that world that said, maybe except in the movie, but what people are most familiar with and think of as Firefly, that's a small. It's
an intimate setting.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas Star Wars is not once it gets rolling under its own weight, that's a big story. You know what I mean? So I feel like once you get the big story in Firefly, you're not really playing Firefly anymore. Now you're playing something else.
Now it's something else.
Right.
And I think that's implicit in a lot of things. Some games and mechanics are obviously better at certain things than others. Like D&D originally was not good at epic level. I mean, it was essentially about a group of adventurers who went around, stabbing bags of treasure to get their experience.
Right.
Make sure I get this right. And the mass combat rules came later.
Right.
I mean, there are certain things like what is it like? Is it BattleTech? And BattleTech, they do, but they have. I mean, if I'm not mistaken,
BattleTech is an interesting thing because it has MechWarrior and BattleTech together.
Yeah.
One is about role playing the pilot or whichever your individual character is, whereas the other one is about mechs on a battle map in like a war game style.
But it's not. But the mechs on a battle map war game style isn't like that's something else we do. I mean, that's a fundamental game in and of itself.
But yeah, they're two separate things that combine together relatively
to create that universe.
Yeah.
No, I played that a couple times.
I think that's an interesting thing to say too about the mechanic when you're talking about your scope, how epic your character is. So kind of that ease of death mechanic. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, if you're
how
playing,
easy is it to?
If you're playing a more vulnerable character, then it would kind of assume that your scope is a little smaller because kind of what you talked about, your realm of influence. How much can I influence if I can be killed at any moment, as opposed to if I'm an epic, heroic, it's going to take lots of power to kill me kind of character, then I probably have a little more influence over the world around me also. So that affects the scope.
And I think we saw that at the end of the last Homebrew Fantasy campaign, where it starts off with individuals fighting, and several times we had mass battles that were just decided, sweeping charges, and there wasn't a lot of chance for personal death, at least right away, because there were 20 waves worth of cavalry charging in front of you. Yeah, I mean, so, how do you resolve those situations?
Well, how does this, now that we've talked about kind of scope and the settings you're going to choose, where does that take you how does that lead you into your plots?
I would say for me, I have to have the end in mind, at least a couple of different ends in mind when I start. Because the kind of plots that I'm going to write, if I think that this group that I'm dealing with, you guys are pretty good at dealing with the politics, at dealing with the maneuvering. So I have to have those characters in there. So I've got to have NPCs and plot lines running in the background that you can interact with and be able to start leading you down whatever path you're going to go. Now, I never really think more than about 2 or 3 steps ahead of you plot-wise. In the last game, if you were obviously moving towards the royal take over the kingdom route. If you had decided to become dungeon delvers and go down and deal with that would have been an entirely different plot line. And so a lot of it, I feel like I can't answer the question in a way because it's very reactive as to what the players are doing. I mean, I'll try and stay 3 steps ahead of you.
So I think what you're saying, let me see if I can get this right, put a finger on it or whatever.
Okay.
You don't so much as and this goes back to a couple episodes ago when we talked about building worlds and that kind of stuff. And themes, is that you build a world that we're going to play in, have us make characters, and then just cut us loose?
In essence, there's always several plot lines going through. There's only so many types of stories you can tell. And if you go out online and you search for the big list of RPG plots, there's 40 or 50 or 20 of them in there. I'll create half a dozen plot lines and say, okay, this plot line leads to the Under Kingdom of the Drow Lord or something. This one leads to your sort of Song and Ice and Fire kind of take over the kingdom. This one leads to dealing with the elves and the ultimate evil, which, may be out there. And I will throw those 6 or 7 plot lines out there. I will literally fish them out there and see which ones you guys bite on. None of them are complete to the end because I don't know what you're going to do. And so once I see where you're going, I go, okay, so these are the kinds of NPCs I need. These are the kinds of end games that might be there. When I say that I'm for a sandbox, that's what I'm talking about. I have these things if you don't react to them, these plot lines will continue to develop in the background in broad strokes. The great evil will still be out there lurking, and eventually, if we play long enough, you'll run into it. And they don't cease to exist. But I wait to see what you guys are actually going to bite onto, and then see where you take it.
Okay. What about you, Lacey?
For me, setting definitely informs the kind of challenges that the players are going to face. So I have my broad theme, and then I have kind of my scope and setting put together. The setting generally inspires the story in general that I want to tell, and it will inspire the end of the game. So what I have in mind for the end, and then the challenges along the way are almost entirely derived from the setting. So, for example, right now we are doing just an episodic Fate in Space game. So I have you guys currently, I took you out of the spaceship and I've set you down on this tropical jungle planet. So when I'm going to set up my plot from there, I try to look at the basic themes that you see in a plot. So man versus man, man versus nature, and man versus God, basically.
No, it's man
right?
versus
Self, man versus self. Okay.
Yeah,
Man
something
versus
like that.
Self, man versus nature, or God, or
Anyways,
whatever.
So, at that point, I try and set up some obstacles that mirror those basic challenges along the way. So I have an overarching plot end for you guys in mind, which I'm obviously not going to reveal right now. But
Darn.
along the way,
We were close.
I've set up some things where, you see things and you have to make these certain decisions. And then, man versus nature is always a pretty easy one. You guys are in a tropical jungle, so
Everything
you had
wants to eat you.
Well, not just that, but I gave you guys a flash flood
Mm-hmm.
to try and deal with.
All
So,
about drainage.
obviously that wouldn't work if my setting was some kind of ice planet. I mean, I guess maybe
It
you
would
could
be
make that
terrifying.
happen, but so the
There's
setting,
Tsunami.
There's a global warming joke in there somewhere. We'll let that one go.
but the setting is informing those smaller challenges. So I have an idea of kind of what kind of challenges I want, and then I let the setting determine the specifics of what they're going to become.
Okay. When I make my plots, I'm kind of like all over the place. It really depends on the kind of game that I'm running. If I'm running a horror game, I like to come up with my end in mind and then drive the players towards that. It's usually pretty easy, especially when it involves horror, because the horror is about the build up to the climax. It's easy to get there. It's not hard. As far as that applies to scope, it's kind of interesting. One of these areas where epic and personal overlap. I ran a Gehenna game, which is the end of the Vampire Masquerade line when the world breaking event happens. And while that is a big, large story where the world breaks, it's actually a very personal story about your individual vampire
But
character.
could we say the scope is very large?
It is, but like at the end, you're locked at the end of the game, the focus is you're locked in one individual building, which happens to be a church, and it's about what you've done in your past. Because actually, when we ran that, only one character survived the entire thing. Because it's about asking for forgiveness for what you've done as a transgression, as a monster, essentially is what it's about. It's a redemption story.
I've never played through that one.
We only ran it one, and I'm not sure.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure I did the best I could have done. That's how we actually finished our Sabbat game that ran for, I don't even know how many years, whatever it was.
Long time.
A ridiculous amount of time, several years. But that's one of those examples where it's a very individual story in a big event.
Okay.
I feel like kind of what we've touched on here is that this scope can change for your game. Because Kurt's talking about starting with a small scope and ending with a large scope. That game was a very large scope that by the end of the game shrank down to this small scope.
Yeah, it was very
very
personal, where we relived
like
experiences and bad things that they had done during their embrace and victims and stuff.
And I would agree that it doesn't need to be linear. You don't need to go up or down or up. It can.
Well, a good example is if you
wibbly wobbly,
timey-wimey. So
plotty waddy. Can I say that?
Scobie Wopey.
Oh no, I did it.
That's terrible. Everybody's going, stop, please. And then the non-Doctor Who fans are like, what in the world is this? Check out Doctor Who. It's awesome.
You have to know
there
Doctor Who. What?
So, I guess, I think you're exactly right, is that your scope can be fluid. Because if you think about some shows, like television shows, some of them are like they're very individual in what they're doing, and then other ones it's a bigger event, and I guess that's what keeps it interesting and keeps you on your toes. Is that fair to say?
So is it good writing then to go narrow and broad when you write?
I think so long as it isn't. It's as long as it's smooth.
It's natural. It's not forced. Otherwise, it's going to make you sick to your
one
stomach.
leads into the other. I just think it makes it better that way.
Right.
I guess, but as far as like other non-horror plots that I write. I don't think of it that way either. I don't know.
Well, yeah, but you do write the plot.
I agree.
You can call it mapping. You can call it laying it out.
I drop the plot like other people drop beats.
Oh, wow. So, but in fantasy games, I'm much more of a sandbox kind of a thing. It's just when I run like a World of Darkness or a straight horror game, I very definitely have an end in mind, and then I work towards that. Now, when I run, what's a fantasy game that I run?
Games should have.
I agree.
Even if you don't know what it is at the start of the first game.
Actually, I disagree. I think you should find the end at the beginning of the game.
No, sometimes you don't know. Sometimes you don't know.
And that's a whole episode.
Here we go. Throw down.
I think it works better if you start out at the beginning.
I actually have it written down, running games with an end in mind. And that'll be a whole actual topic.
Right underneath it where it says, poke Kurt with a sharp stick.
It's written down.
For me, when I run
I cited it. It has a reference.
A fantasy game, I think that I much more prefer to like you say, lay things out and see where they go. It's just I don't run a lot of those games anymore. Most of what I run now is horror, I guess.
Do you have
Oh no, I guess like I run a Dragonlance game. It's a pretty, I don't know, a moderate size scope game. You know,
tools when you design your game that help you.
I do
keep it on track.
I do mind mapping for my initial things, which I don't know if there's an app I actually have that works really well. So mind mapping is where you write a central concept in the middle of it, and then you draw a circle around it, and then you draw lines off of it. That this is all actually how I map out our episodes as well. So like in the center of it, it says, you know, building a game. Then off the one side it says inspiration. And then another line goes to setting and scope.
Detective film.
Yeah, where you're drawing lines to other things. I use that initially, and then once I have the game running, I kind of use that as my fallback to, like when I talk about running games with a theme in mind. That's what I go back to refer to make sure that everything I'm doing is driving towards those things. And I do update it sometimes, usually not too much though. And then other than that, it's just usually notes that I have.
I've seen note cards. We have one GM that likes to use note cards. He has a separate note card for each NPC. Lays them out. Caleb does that.
Oh yeah, because he had them laid out in front of everybody. That was an interesting way to do things. There's some actual interesting tools now that people I've seen online where they're using them also for Fate to write temporary aspects and stuff on, whether they're like dry erase cards or plastic cards that you can easily wipe off the Sharpie or whatever.
Fate like that.
What other tools do I use?
Well, I guess I'm pretty boring. I use 3-ring binders, pieces of paper, and I write down information on NPCs with them. I'll try and do timelines to remind myself of the things that have happened. I'll have plot points in there. I try to keep track of the years that pass in game or the seasons, because I've got some things that are going to happen regardless of what you do unless you go kill that person. And those things are going to pop regardless. But I think that's pretty much what I do. Timelining, and I'll even write a short narrative. No, actually, I know what I do. I write down a narrative of what's going to happen in the world if you guys don't do anything. If you all just never existed, this is how the world is going to tick out, and then you get dropped in the middle of the action, in essence, and affect it. So I suppose I do decide an end.
I was just going to say, so you write a story that has an end to start with.
Yeah, I very much think so. I don't think you realize it, but because we talked about it before.
But the world doesn't end. I mean,
no, it's not that it has the world is going to end, but the story.
I don't go like 2 billion years from now, the sun will go nowhere.
Right. So what about you, Lacey?
I am, for the most part, I would say just notebook and ink pen kind of person. I write bits of story to happen as well, like things that I plan to read no matter what, and I want them to be kind of catching. And then I also do a fair amount of pictures because I find them to be very helpful, even if you guys never see them. So like if I have a place in mind, then I will find a picture that I find inspirational. Like so for the horror story that we have coming up, I've got a picture of a mansion, and I spent a fair amount of time just Googling images of old mansions until I found one that I liked. And then it's kind of, I have that picture to go off of, and it's slightly different in my head than it is exactly in that image. But then from there, I was able like, okay, so this is where we're at. And then I built on the era that we're going to be in and slowly started to add NPCs that live within this place. And, you know, the whole spooky haunted mansion thing is what inspires the challenges that happen, you know, farther on down the plot. But so mostly ink and paper. I would love to be able to just sit down and make a computer file, but the creativity is just not the same for me.
No, there's something very tactile about writing things down. Also, it helps me remember things when I actually physically write it versus when there's a lot of comedy writers talk about how it's just, or writers in general talk about they don't have the same experience typing as they do physically writing. So I wonder if that's a generational thing or not.
But there's actually some studies out there as far as like academic wise, taking notes with pen and paper, you retain the information better than if you're typing it. Even if you're listening for specific context highlights instead of typing word for word, you still remember it better if you write it down.
So something I want to mention.
So there's something to that.
That I thought about just now. Yeah,
sorry, I just had to add that in.
It's all good. So I've ran lots of World of Darkness LARPs, several of them for long periods of time. And the plotting and the note-taking that I did for those were drastically different. In LARP, most of them,
how so?
Note card is king because all items are on note cards. There's just note cards everywhere. Okay. So a lot of my NPCs were on note cards. And then as the game progressed, I had a stack of note cards in my pocket. And then when you know, whoever, you know, the Imperator or whatever, whenever they did something, or someone did something that would affect them, or like something just as significant for that character, I would jot it down on the back of the note card real quick, stick it in my pocket, and then like after the game was over, the day after, the next day on the game, I would sort of debrief myself, get all those things out, go through them all, and then I had actual pieces of paper for those individuals, because Vampire the Masquerade, specifically in LARP, is very political oriented, so everybody is angling for something. So there's a lot to manage as a game master with that. And especially at that time, we had about 20 players, and it was, me as a game master or storyteller, and then I had either one or two assistant storytellers that were there for rules education, but not for plot stuff. It just made a significant difference in my ability to track that information. Now, granted, it's a lot different because
you're up and moving around, so you have to have something that is
portable,
smaller, and easy to
see. And I think the takeaway from all this from plot is have a plot tracking device of some kind. I don't care what it is.
Right.
I mean, if it's on the back of a napkin, make sure you have a good supply of napkins.
The other thing that I find helpful is if you have every group seems to have at least one player that takes good notes. And as a game master, is to look at those notes, because you can very clearly tell this is what they have thought is important. Because if they didn't think it was that important, they didn't write it down. Yeah. So that is what you can use as a guide to tell you, is this plot sinking in? Yes or no? Are they way off base? If it's some kind of investigation thing, it's a way to kind of audit yourself. And also, if you've got themes that are not hitting, that they're not making note of, it can tell you that I need to hit this point a little harder, make sure I emphasize it, or whatever it is that you need to do.
Yeah. So
I mean, your recap works well for that too.
That's something that we started.
Players' notes.
That came from Mouse Guard, actually. Mouse Guard has a thing that you actually mechanically you get a benefit. It rotates around the table. No one can do it the same like twice in a row, but someone does a recap of what happened last game, and they get, I think, a persona point or a fate point for doing that. So there's a mechanical benefit to it, but it gets people in the mood for gaming. It cuts the table talk down at the beginning at the initial, because then they're like, oh yeah, I remember that. That was great. It sparks ideas, gets the creative juices flowing and that kind of stuff, and leads right into it. All right, so I think we're just going to kind of wrap things up there. It's one of these weird topics that is very fluid, and there's not a definite answer to it. I think there's
a lot of right answers, I think.
Well, yeah, as long as things move along and they move smoothly, I don't think there's a wrong way to do it.
Yeah, no.
I do think that you should always keep this scope in mind as your game progresses. Setting is kind of static once you pick it. That's sort of what it is, unless you have like a multiverse traveling game. And we're going to talk specifically in some different ways about plots geared towards different themes, and how we build those specifically. This is just sort of like some broad strokes of things here. Yeah, I guess pick a setting, stick with it, and make sure that your game moves along smoothly from both big to large, or big to small, or small to big, I guess you could say.
Yeah, whatever is plot appropriate. But I think the takeaway for me from this, because it made me think about it, was definitely have some changes in focus, have some changes in, of course it has to fit within your plot and setting, but have some changes in scope. Mix it up for just a little bit, but you got to be careful, I think, after listening to you guys talk, not to break your own setting with a scope change.
Right. Or if you do, you transition to it. You gradually, if you're going to go from small to very big, you can't just make that jump. You have to ease into it, kind of like if you think of it as a funnel, the funnel doesn't go from, really small to really big. It gradually gets there.
Yeah, no. And that's, just have a plan, regardless of how you come together with it, regardless of how you organize it or start putting it together, have a plan. And I think that's probably...
I think that kind of goes without saying. I think most people have that.
Yeah, but just think about it with your players. How is this going? And I think a lot of the pacing issues that folks see around the table and that sort of thing can be solved with going, okay, let me take a look at how I'm writing this plot. Is there anything I can do to get rid of those?
That's almost an after-action thing, though. You can't do that in mid-game. But yeah, I agree with that very much. I auditing your game is a good way to make sure your scope is transitioning well for what people are keeping track of and what they're enjoying.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have anything else, Lacey? Right on. All right, so I guess that'll finish it off. Along with this, you guys should on Friday. We'll be dropping our review of The Quiet Year, so that's kind of a game that talks about scope and world building. I guess it's a game designed for that, so look for that on Friday. I guess that'll do it for us. We'll see you guys next Wednesday.
Right on.
Thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Just One More Fix. Music has been provided by Kevin MacLeod. You can find him at incompetech.com. You can find us at justonemorefix.com and follow us on Twitter at JustOneMoreFix.